The scar ran from her left wrist to the inside of her elbow, a wide, pale ridge, the kind of tissue that forms when the burn goes deep enough to touch bone. I noticed it during the gear check, the way you notice anything that doesn't fit the inventory sheet. Then Sergeant First Class Dale Morrow noticed it too. What happened next I have thought about every day for 11 years. Morrow ran the hangar eval like he ran everything, loud and certain. Bob Denton's main bay was 200 feet of concrete, the smell of hydraulic fluid and old fuel, afternoon light slanting in through the bay doors in long flat columns. We had 43 personnel on the floor that day, a mix of infantry, attached specialists, and 3 people I didn't recognize who had arrived the night before with a single vehicle and no explanation. She was one of them. Plain uniform, no unit patch I could place. A plate carrier that had seen more use than anything in our motor pool. She had dark hair pulled back and the kind of stillness that either means you're bored or you've been places where stillness kept you alive. Morrow was working down the line doing kit checks, and he got to her and stopped. He looked her over the way he always looked at people he had already decided about, and then he reached out and pushed her left sleeve up to the elbow. He held her arm up, half turned toward the platoon. "What is that?" he said. "You get those falling off a bar stool?" The room laughed. Not everyone, maybe half, maybe fewer, but enough that the sound filled the bay and bounced off the far wall. I was 12 feet away and I did not say a word. I tell myself now that it happened too fast, that by the time I understood what I was seeing, it was already over. It's partially true, and mostly a lie. She looked at him. Not past him, not at the floor, directly at him. Her expression did not change. "You want to discuss my kit," she said. "Or you want to discuss the evaluation?" Morrow dropped her arm and took a half step back. He covered it by crossing his arms. "I want to discuss," he said, slower now, working the room, "how someone walks into my evaluation with 0 unit identification and a sleeve full of mystery and expects me to run her through the same protocol as my people." "Run me through whatever you want," she said. He took that for a moment. I watched him calculate. Toon was watching him calculate. That part, the pause. I think about that pause. "All right," he said. "You want to demonstrate something for us?" "These hold your file, says you know." He gestured toward the open center of the floor. "Pick someone. Show me the first 3 sequences from the Level 2 ground protocol." He said it the way you say something when you're certain the answer will embarrass the other person. He meant it as the end of the conversation. She looked at the floor, then at the assembled personnel and said, "Biggest." A specialist named Carver stepped forward. Carver was 6'2" and had spent 2 years before the service doing amateur wrestling. He was what Morrow had in mind. The circle tightened around them. She shook her hands out once, loosely, and set her stance. First sequence she walked through at half speed. That was the part people laughed about later. They thought she was being cautious, or uncertain, showing off how carefully she'd memorized the form. They were wrong. She was calibrating Carver. Feeling where he carried his weight, how he loaded his hips when he planted. By the time the first sequence ended with Carver's wrist locked behind him and his cheek an inch from the crete, she had everything she needed. The second sequence, she ran at 3/4 speed. No hesitation. Carver was good. He didn't fight the form the way untrained personnel do, throwing muscle at a problem that muscle won't solve. He knew what he was doing. He went to the floor anyway, and went cleanly, and came up looking at her differently than he'd looked at her when he stepped forward. The third sequence she ran at full speed. I don't have better language for what I saw. I have tried for 11 years to describe it to people who weren't in that hangar, and I keep arriving at the same inadequate place. It was like watching someone read a sentence they had written themselves. No wasted motion, no searching, no space between decision and execution. Carver went down and stayed down for a moment, not because he was hurt, he wasn't, but because his body needed a second to understand what had just been done to it. The hangar was quiet. Morrow's arms were still crossed. His expression had moved somewhere I couldn't quite read. Not quite the face of a man who has made a mistake, not yet the face of a man who knows he has. Something in between suspended. She waited. She was barely breathing hard. 4, she said. 5. He nodded once, and Carver got up, and she ran the last 2 sequences in full, and when it was done, Carver shook out his wrist and looked at the floor, and then looked at her and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the sequences hadn't already said. That was when Colonel Yates, who had been standing at the back of the bay with a tablet, said, "Sergeant First Class Morrow." His voice was even. It carried without effort. "Yes."
"Come look at this."
Morrow walked to the colonel. I watched the colonel turn the tablet toward him. I watched Morrow read whatever was on it. It took him about 15 seconds, and in those 15 seconds, his posture changed in a way I have never seen a man's posture change before or since. Not collapse. Something more controlled than that. The kind of change that happens when a person understands something in full, and then has to decide what to do with the understanding. He handed the tablet back to the colonel and walked the length of the hangar floor to where she was. Standing, she had pulled her sleeve back down. She was looking at the bay doors. He stopped 2 feet in front of her and came to full attention and rendered a formal salute. Held it. The kind of hold that isn't crisp anymore, that has some weight behind it. She returned it. Then she looked at him. He said, "I apologize for what I said. That was wrong." She held his gaze for a moment and said, "Let's run your people through 4 and 5. They were rusty on the transition, that was all." She walked to the center of the floor and waited. I found out later, in pieces, what the colonel's tablet had shown. The evaluation protocol we had been using for 8 months. The one Morrow had just asked her to demonstrate. She had written it. 3 years earlier, after her second deployment, assembled from doctrine gaps she had cataloged across 4 theaters. The Level 2 ground protocol, the transition sequence between 4 and 5 that Morrow was right we were rusty on, all of it hers. The 2 silver stars attached to her file were classified. The citations were redacted to a summary line each. The call sign on the record read Dusk Rail. The scar, the file noted in a medical annex, was a contact burn sustained during a direct action raid in which she had pulled 2 personnel from a vehicle fire. Date classified. Location classified. She ran us through 4 and 5 twice more before the light changed in the bay doors and the eval day ended. I shook her hand when she was leaving. I didn't know what to say, which is not a state I am often in. She looked at me, and I think she understood what I was trying to say, and did not need me to say it. What I remember most, if I'm being honest, is not the 5 sequences. It is the moment before the first one. The moment when Morrow gestured toward the center of the floor, absolutely certain, and she looked at the floor and then said, quietly, "Who's biggest?" Not a performance, not a statement, just the next correct step in a problem she had already solved. I've run a lot of evaluations since Fob Denton. I run them differently. I read every attachment. I have since that afternoon on the hangar floor, when a woman I didn't know held 5 sequences of her own doctrine in her hands, and waited without impatience for the room to catch up.